Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another show. Thank you so much for joining me today. I have a very special guest with me. His name is Miko Peled. Miko is a man who I've been intending to speak to for a while now. He describes himself as an Israeli anti-Zionist. Miko comes from a family of people who were participating in the establishment of Israel. His father, Miko Peled, participated in the 1948 war and was considered as one of the big heroes of the 1967 war. Later on, his father, Mati, became a staunch peace activist, and Miko followed his path. Miko participated in elite units in the Israeli army, and he became a very profound peace activist who is now calling for a one democratic state solution in Palestine. So, Miko, thank you so much for joining me and welcome to the show.
We're happy to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, Miko, many people can't get their head around the fact that some Israelis call themselves anti-Zionists, although I always personally distinguish between Israelis, Jews, Zionists, and Semites, saying that you can have a combination of these things, but not necessarily all of them all at once. Would you mind if you would elaborate to our viewers, especially those who are not familiar with you or your books, a little bit more about your background, how you came to take the position of an anti-Zionist peace activist?
Sure, that's a great question. So I would invite people to look at history. You know, one of the people who were commanders of the ANC armed resistance were white Jewish South Africans. Joe Slovo was one of the commanders of the ANC's armed wing. He was white. He was also Jewish. He happened to be Jewish as well. And there were many white South Africans who were still South Africans. They're still white, but they opposed apartheid. There were Germans who opposed the Nazis, and so on. So, you know, it's possible to come from within a particular culture and then reject the political implications and the oppression that this culture brings. Zionism created Israel, like you said, and my family was heavily involved in the Zionist project before the state was established and after. I rejected once I was able to learn, you know, what actually took place, what the Zionists did, and engage with Palestinians and engage with you know, Palestinian sisters and brothers who are part of the Palestinian resistance. Then, of course, I had no choice but to reject Zionism and to reject everything Zionism stands for, and to reject the existence of the State of Israel. So, I mean, it's not unique in that regard. I mean, there are you know, examples in history of things like this happening in the past.
Beautiful. I read your book, General Son, that I recommend to my viewers, and I will leave links to your book as well. It's a very interesting book because not only does it talk about your history, it talks about your transition from a person who served in the establishment, from a family that comes from this establishment, to all of a sudden taking this anti-establishment position. How did it feel like moving from a position of a person who is serving, who participated in the establishment of something, of the State of Israel, in which case, and then taking a complete opposite stance and breaking the barriers of fear, because it takes quite a lot for someone to break all of those barriers, especially when it relates to social position as well. I mean, your father, he was very well known in Israel. You had ties with senior figures in Israel. Would you mind elaborating to our viewers a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah, the beginning is hard. The beginning is like I compare it to, you know, cutting off your own arm without anesthesia, because you're cutting off a part of who you are. But the end is liberating because you're discovering something much greater, and you become part of something that is much greater. So it's actually a liberating process once you realize, because you know, when you're in it and you have to take an honest look at what is taking place in Palestine, you see that there's an injustice. I mean, I saw, growing up in West Jerusalem as I did, I didn't know how to say the word apartheid, but you see the apartheid. You see the Palestinians in the Palestinian neighborhoods who look and live and exist in a completely different reality than I did. Completely different, and not in a good way. You can see clearly that they do not have the things that I had. So, you know, the common wisdom is, well, it's because they are incapable of creating the kind of conditions that we curated because we are superior. But that's not really a convincing enough argument. Why would they not have the same schools, the same playgrounds, sidewalks, access to swimming pools, access to, you know, all the stuff that you have when you live in a modern state? And besides, they're just a kilometer away. I mean, how hard could it be to extend what we have to them? Why? So you see it. Now, if you pause to think about it and you engage and you're aware of what takes place, at some point, you have to either accept it or reject it. At some point, because you understand it's there. And then it's a question of values. If your values allow you to accept it, that's one thing. But if your values do not allow you to accept it, then you have to reject it. That's what happened with me.
Cool. And you mentioned that your family had ties with Benjamin Netanyahu specifically, and if I'm not mistaken, you had met Benjamin Netanyahu previously. I recall that. And from your meetings with Benjamin Netanyahu, although that might be a long time ago, how does his personality, from what you recall, translate to his actions politically? This is the man that has been in charge of this genocide that's been happening in Gaza for 8 months now. How would you translate his personality and how it affects his political decision making? Many people call him a psychopath, a person who is only obsessed with his career. How do you view that?
Well, you know, I knew him when I was a kid, and he was a war hero, so to speak. He was a commander in one of these Israeli commando units and so on, as his brother was. And so there was this mythology. And I knew him because he was in the group of friends of my older siblings. And so that's that's kind of how I knew him to begin with. Later on, once it was clear, you know, when I grew up and I was able to, you know, take a better look at who this man is and what he stands for, it's clear that he's a psychopath. It's clear that he's a megalomaniac. He's a very good politician, and he is an ideologue, kind of a fascist, racist ideologue of those kind, a white supremacist of the worst kind. And because he has this way of harming people, and you see that when it comes to the U.S. I mean, Bill Maher, Jordan Peterson, all these journalists just fall at his feet, and nobody challenges him on the fact that he's been presiding over this genocidal state for over a decade. He's been presiding over this apartheid regime he's been a part of it for much longer, but he's actually been presiding as prime minister for more than a decade. Nobody ever challenges him because he has this way of charming people. But there's no question that the man is a psychopath. And other than the fact that he's very good, he's a very good, as far as Israeli politicians go, he is the best. That's why he's still in power. He's not in power because people like him. He's in power because he knows how to manipulate the system. But there's no question that he's the worst kind of genocidal maniac that we've seen in a very long time.
I view resistance, including the armed resistance, especially in the case of Palestine as well, as a symptom or an antidote to a virus called Zionism, or at least Zionism as it portrays itself. Would you agree with this notion, or do you have a different view that the Palestinians could somehow get their rights with non-violence, although they are constantly being met with violence?
I'm not the one to answer that question. Palestinians need to be answering that question, not me. It's not for me to tell Palestinians how they resist. I know Palestinians who obviously engage in armed resistance, and obviously we know that the vast majority actually of Palestinian resistance over the years has been unarmed. People make the choices they make. And so how effective it is, in a way, Palestinians exist in what I think could be compared to a maximum security prison of the worst kind, with torture and the worst kinds of abuses on a daily basis. I'm not talking about the prisoners in the prison today, which is a whole other level of horror. I'm talking about day-to-day Palestinians over the last 75, 76 years. They've been living under a reign of terror in what basically amounts to a maximum security prison. The resources Palestinians have in order to resist are limited. So they do what they feel is best. We have people like Isamar in Hebron, and he makes a conscious choice to do things a particular way. You've got the Palestinians in Jenin and Nablus, and they choose to do it a different way, or the Palestinian Bedouin in Naqab, and they do what they do. I mean, Palestinians do whatever it is they can. And of course we know that the Palestinians in Gaza have managed to do what nobody thought anybody could do, which is basically shut down the state of Israel for the last 8 months. So there are various types of resistance based on the capabilities and the vision of the people who are there. Again, I don't think it's certainly not for me to tell what to do. My job is to support it. My job is to stand with Palestinians and be in the spaces that they cannot come to. They cannot come to Washington D.C. They cannot be here, and so that's how I see my job, is to stand with them and to use my voice as much as I can to support them, but not to in any way judge them.
Absolutely. It makes a lot of sense, because I feel like a lot of people are trying to impose their will on the Palestinian people, especially leaders who are aligned particularly with Benjamin Netanyahu, talking about the day after, for example, when it comes to Gaza. And something that I always repeat is that it's the Gazan population who decide what's best for them. Who are we to decide anywhere across the world, even Palestinians in other parts, really, for these people who have been under a siege for 17 years now, people who are descendants of Nakba survivors and Naksa survivors from 1948 to 1967, how to go about and how to run their lives. And it seems like there's a very big difference in terms of the way the Palestinian case is approached from particularly certain leaders in Western powers as to, for example, other leaders of the world, including in Russia and even in China, where they try and unite the Palestinian people and advise them as to what to do, whereas you have this patronizing and condescending approach from some leaders who are tied with Benjamin Netanyahu and are trying to save Israel's image more than Israel itself, by the way. We're hearing a lot of talk in Israel from previous heads of state, senior analysts, people in the military and the intelligence establishment, that we're witnessing an existential threat to Israel. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think they are facing an existential threat. I think they know it, and I don't think necessarily that that's a bad thing. I think threatening the existence of an apartheid regime is not a bad thing. Israel is an apartheid state, and its existence should be threatened. In fact, I think its existence should be eliminated as an apartheid regime. Now, I know what the other side say. When we say this, they say, you want to kill all the Jews. That's their interpretation. But eliminating an apartheid regime, a genocidal apartheid regime at that, is a good thing. And they are right. There is an existential threat, and then they know it. And that's why they operate the way they do. That's why anything Palestinians say suddenly becomes an expression of violence and racism, which of course it never is. People are arguing, even now here in the campus activism here in the U.S., when the young Palestinians are calling from the river to the sea, Palestine should be free. They're being lectured that is not a nice thing to say. First of all, that's where Palestine exists. So where else is there a Palestine other than between the river and the sea? But besides that, what could be a more beautiful vision than a free, liberated, peaceful Palestine, on all historic Palestine? So the way they interpret it and they turn things around. But that is the answer. I mean, the answer is to eliminate and get rid of the apartheid regime and replace it with a real democracy with equal rights.
And how do you think we can get there?
Well, I mean, there are plenty of roadmaps. I mean, apartheid is probably apartheid South Africa is probably the closest one. Severe sanctions, a complete embargo on on arms, of course. Total boycott. I mean, there's a discussion now. FIFA is supposed to decide, I think, on the 20th, whether or not they're going to suspend Israel. So making sure Israel kicked out of all these arenas, whether they're sporting arenas, cultural arenas, any areas, academics, certainly closing down diplomatic missions and so on, and putting the pressure on until the system collapses, and then we can replace it with something else. So I mean, I think there needs to be done more than of what is being done already, and I think that, and again, going back to what students have been demanding, across the board on campuses, here, and by the way, in the UK and in Europe and other places, a complete divestment, and to shut it down until such time that the system collapses. And by the way, it's interesting because that's precisely what the Palestinian fighters in Gaza did. They shut it down. They were able to shut down the state of Israel. They're being punished heavily, of course, but they were able to shut it down, and shutting it down is precisely what needs to happen. There needs to be severe, heavy divestment, heavy sanctions, until such time as the system collapses.
Lovely. And how do you view this particular war ending? Many people have different interpretations. I mean, I personally think, because I've witnessed so many escalations throughout the years, that motivated me to write my book about a one-state solution, a one-state democratic solution between the Jordan River to the sea, for everyone to live in peacefully, Palestinians, Israelis, without supremacy. And I feel like this time it's a little bit different than before. So my view previously was, look, what Israel does, they'll have an escalation, de-escalation, temporary deal. They buy more time in what they call in Hebrew ma'rakha bin ma'rakhot, or campaign between campaigns, to have a certain campaign, attack, and de-escalate, and they have everything under control. Whereas this time I find it more difficult, if not even impossible, for them to reach such a stage because of the level of escalation. So I personally view it as a case of either a constant open war and a war of attrition, right, or a small de-escalation with a very high tension that could potentially explode in any given moment afterwards. What do you think? How do you think it would potentially end?
It's going to end when it ends. I mean, I think the goal needs to be ending the genocide of the Palestinians, and ending it now, and forever, and putting in place political reality, a political solution that guarantees the safety and security of Palestinians forever, so that no Palestinian is killed or terrorized ever again in their homeland. That needs to be the goal, and the only way to do that is to dismantle apartheid and establish a free democratic Palestine for the ANC. I think that's really the only conversation that I think is relevant. Nothing else will guarantee the safety of Palestinians. Nothing else will ever allow the freedom of Palestinian prisoners, who, as we know now, live in a living hell. I mean, it's even worse than it's ever been before. You may have seen the picture of Bassem Shanini, who was a close friend of mine.
I did, yeah, and other prisoners as well, yeah.
It's horrifying. So, I mean, nothing is going to end that but the complete dismantling of the apartheid state and the establishing of a free democratic Palestine. Nothing else. There's no other thing that can bring us to that point where we can guarantee the safety and security of Palestinians. So I think our job as the advocates for Palestine on the outside is to push every button and to express it in the most clear and unwavering and uncompromising way. This is what needs to happen, and nothing less is acceptable.
Beautiful, lovely. Well, Miko, you've been more concise and sharper than I even anticipated, and I think we'll wrap it up there then, because that answered pretty much all of my questions. Again, thank you so much for coming on my show. Thank you to all of our viewers who listened. I will be sharing Miko's social media platforms, including a link to his book for all of you to follow him, and also buy his book that I highly recommend. I read his book in a matter of a few hours because it was very easy to read, and I found it very close. And again, thank you so much, Miko, for joining me, and I wish you all the best. And to all of our viewers, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you soon in the next episode.
Thank you.